Your PC's job is to essentially turn electricity into just ones and zeros, with heat being a massive byproduct of this transformation. More heat means a louder system and worse, less performance, as your CPU and GPU throttle their performance to save their pitiful lives. Now there is a lot to go through, and I'm going to be pitching this, or at least try to, for all competencies, right from beginners. So use the chapter markers if you'd like to skip ahead to a section that only you care about. And a little teeny tiny disclaimer. I'm going to be making a lot of sweeping statements, because there are just so many variables to consider. The size of your case, fan orientation, fan size, airflow of the case, ambient room temperature, and the list just goes on. So while this tutorial will provide you with some of the necessary workflow and tools, you'll need to do some tweaks on your side just to get the most out of it. But there's genuinely nothing to be afraid of, as it's all just really simple once you get your head around it. Primarily, there are two types of fans: DC and pulse width modulation, or PWM. DC fans are a little old school. They have like 3 pins and run at like a set RPM, so we're not going to focus on them. We mainly care about PWM fans, which have 4 pins and what we consumers consume nowadays. To put PWM simply, we can just control how much power is going to them, which can change the fan speed. I'm not going to cover ARGB, as to put it gently, all ARGB software in my opinion just sucks. But if that's what you want, you do you, homie. Now, your motherboard is going to have some PWM headers, which you're going to connect your fans to. This is going to vary between motherboards, depending on your brand. But typically, the more expensive and the larger the motherboard, the more PWM headers it has. All boards are going to have this one particular header, which should be labeled CPU, and maybe one additional one labeled CHA for chassis. And more typically these days, you'll see one for AIO, which, as the name suggests, is for connecting your all-in-one liquid cooler or AIO pump. You'll want to always connect something to the CPU header, as your BIOS may throw up an error on boot and force you to press a key to continue to your operating system. A single header can take a single fan or a group of fans which are daisy-chained together, and a single header can typically handle 1 amp, and each fan is typically 0.3 amps. So I wouldn't go over a group of 3 fans per header if you can help it. But say you have a chassis that can house a whole bunch of fans, but you've run out of PWM headers. You could use a PWM fan hub. They're inexpensive, they allow you to add a bunch more fans, and they're typically just powered via SATA, which your power supply should already have. Perfect, right? Well, not so fast. My main issue with PWM fan hubs is that each of the ports in the hub can't be individually controlled. Your PC will just see this hub as one controllable fan. This may not be an issue for your build. I kind of want a little more control, so I can just have a single hub and have separate controls for the front, for the top, and for the rear of my chassis. And that is where this puppy comes in, which I need to get open. Always cut towards you. Come on. Doesn't help that it's like freezing in here. And that's where this puppy comes in. The fan controller by Karanovich Research. Sorry if I've completely messed that up. Full disclosure, I paid full price for my first and second controller. And while I was chatting to the creator about this project, he gave me a partial refund on the second controller after I had paid full price. So I understand that I have some bias, but I would have gladly paid full price for this. What I will say is that these are made in really small batch. They are not cheap, and you will need to make your own enclosure for it using like a 3D printer, or just, MacGyvering it with cardboard like I did. But there is simply nothing like it on the market. And it's kind of in a league of its own. With this, I can easily control 10 groups of fans independently and not need any proprietary software. I am hoping one day this thing goes mainstream. Now, let's get to cooling. So I need to plug this in. Just give me a second. Lucky enough, this is USB-C, so I don't really have to put it directly into the header. I can actually just use one of the USB-C ports on the motherboard. Aha! Hopefully I don't need power. One tiny gripe I have about this thing is that it's got this like heartbeat sensor almost on it that you just, can't deactivate or install, but Black Sharpie or enclosure will solve that problem. Not a biggie. I need to get some fans. Give me a sec. These are kind of the only ones that I have on hand. I had these before swapping over to the Noctua G2s. And very shill. Quit shilling. Let me just show you. This is a jank setup, boys, but for the purposes of demonstration, it's gonna do. So here is my OpenFan controller. As you can see, we have 10 separate headers for you to connect some fans, group of fans, single fan, your choice. It plugs in via USB. either to a header on your motherboard or, like as I have, just to the back of the PC, and say to power to give power to all the fans. Okay, first things first, we're going to head over to getfancontrol.com, and assuming you're on Windows 10 or 11, download the installer for .NET. Okay, accept, and make sure to read the entire EULA. Next, 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 next. And we're going to launch FanControl. It's going to warn us that we need to download and install .NET. Save, download, install. We're just going to have to do this once, so don't worry. Okay, I'm going to let this do its thing. Now we're going to launch FanControl, and it's going to ask us to install something called PWM. That's PAWN. Yeah, very funny. Okay, going to sell my soul to the devil. Installed. Okay, it's going to ask us for our language. That's fine. Now I'm going to say no to the assisted setup just temporarily, as I want to install the plugin for OpenFan controller. This step only applies to you if you do have one of these controllers. It can be a little tricky to find, so I'll put a link in the description down below so you can grab it easily. Why the hell am I using Bing? So you're going to get a warning when downloading, but you can deal with that. We're not going to place the DLL into the plugins folder. All we're going to do is open FanControl, head over to settings, install plugin. We are going to just select the DLL we just downloaded, successfully installed. And as you can see, it's populated 10 more fans, which are the 10 headers on the OpenFan controller. Now what we're going to do is run through FanControl's assisted setup. This does a couple of things, but the first thing it does is it checks if there's any fans that it can control, you know, your GPU one, any of the PWMs connected to your motherboard. If you've got a little fan over your VRMs, I know some high-end motherboards have these nowadays. And then, because we added OpenFan control, it's going to test each of those headers individually. And when I say test, what it's going to do is send a signal to that particular header, ramp up the fan to figure out its max speed, and then ramp it back down again to figure out how low can you go. So, blah, blah, blah. Yes, we want to test the motherboard, CPU, GPU, etc. Now, I'm going to record this because it is going to ramp up each of the fans to 100% immediately. I don't know if you guys can hear this, but everything is ramping up. So now is our opportunity to go in and name these something that makes it like user-friendly, so you know, instead of having like, you know, fan 2 or OpenFan 1, etc., etc. So the way I like to do this is I set a particular fan to 0 and I look at it inside my case and I check which one has gone to 0, and then I give it the appropriate name. So let's have a look at this one. So this one is just appropriately called fan 2, and I have a feeling it's going to be the CPU one. So what we're going to do is we're going to set this guy to 0 and see what happens. Aha! Found you. So that one was pretty simple and straightforward. Let's go ahead and call this CPU. Fine, I'll just put it back to 50 so that I don't incinerate my CPU. 9070 XT, that's fine. So now we've got a few more. Mine are called OpenFan 1 and 10 because of this. So for our purposes, let's just say that this is the top of our computer, and we set this to 0. Watch and see. Okay, cool, those fans are spinning down, so that must be the top of the chassis. And that's pretty much it. We just need to rinse and repeat, give everything an appropriate name. So, okay, we're going to choose start at logon because we want it to start at logon, and start minimize because we don't really need to have a look at it every time we start. And that's pretty much giving FanControl everything it needs to make any of the necessary changes that we're going to do. What I'm going to do really quickly is just come here, save our configuration so that when it starts up, you do have to do it every single time you make a change. I'm going to tell you the way that I set it up, and you know, this is the way I just like to do it. You may agree with it, you may have your own way of doing it. That's completely up to you, sir. So I never touch the GPU. I kind of let the GPU do its own thing, ramp up, ramp down according to its own settings. I'm not going to apply that. The things that I am interested in are what the CPU speed is going to be, what the top is going to be, and what the rear is going to be. Just a note, if you have an AIO, Jay's 2 cents has done in-depth review on what's the best pump speed. So if you do have a separate control for your AIO, I would just set that at 80%, leave it and forget it. Don't attach it to any fan curves. Especially me, because when I used to set my AIO to any curves, I would get that annoying ramp up and ramp down sound, and I just didn't like it. FanControl is made up of just 3 parts: controls, graphs, and optionally sensors. Control being anything we can control, like our CPU fans, chassis fans, AIO pump, etc. Sensors being where you're taking your temperature reading from. In most cases, this is going to be your CPU temperature, GPU temperature, or perhaps a mix of both, which we'll cover in a second. And finally, graphs or curves, which is the only part of this equation you'll be tweaking really, and ties both the fans and the sensors together. The easiest way I've found to understand this is to get your mind around this equation. When my something sensor
is at a specific temperature, set this control to this percentage.
When setting this up, again, there's a lot of variables because, do you play with open back headphones? Do you play with closed back headphones? Do you even use headphones? Do you use speakers? Because someone that's not using headphones, they're going to be far more susceptible to sound. You could be in a very, very noisy environment where your fan speeds are not really going to make that much of a difference. Here we've got like a whole bunch of very noisy, loud machines, and it's not going to really make a difference. I 99% of the time am playing with big pair of Odyssey Maxwells, so PC is also quite far away from me, so I don't really hear it. But if it's like next to you on a desk and you're using speakers, that's sort of worst case scenario, and if you are sensitive to sound. To illustrate the seesaw we're perpetually balancing on, I've made this inaccurate Venn diagram. But we can use it to illustrate what we're after. There are primarily three things we're trying to harmonize: temperature, performance, and volume. If we try to focus too much on two of these things, we risk compromising one of the other factors. But we're seeking a perfect balance, what I like to call the G spot, or a gamer spot. The gamer's nexus, if you will. Cool, performant, and quiet. An example of this is my current PC, which has three groups of fans. The top ones for their AIO exhausting warm CPU air, fans on the front to intake fresh air, and fans on the rear to exhaust the warm air. My rationale behind this, again, is when I start a game and the GPU power goes over 9000, it's dumping a bunch of hot air into the system, and I want the chassis fans to both exhaust that hot air and bring in some fresh cool air to keep everything running at peak performance. Of course, ramping up the CPU fans may help when I'm in game, but they really don't need to. They do, however, ramp up when the CPU is under load, like for example in shader compilation, but they do stay quiet when I'm in game and only ramp up if they need to keep Mr. CPU cool. So the first two things that I like to go on is what are the operating temperatures that my equipment is typically running on, and the second thing is what's the max I can set the fans at to be at that level so that it's not being an annoyance towards me. Because the higher, we can set the fans to 100% and it can be super loud and noisy, but it's going to be, unbearable for someone to just sit next to it. Good Lord, I forget how bad the coil one is on this Gigabyte 9070 XT. It's honestly ear piercing. The first thing we'd like to do is establish the max volume for our fans that we're willing to tolerate. The easiest way I found to do this is by opening up a YouTube video at our usual listening volume. Now open up FanControl, set our fans to manual. Now drag the sliders to where you'd like to set your fan percentage, up or down, until they're at a tolerable listening volume. Remember, the more airflow you give your PC, the better it's going to perform. Next, we need to know the temperatures that our CPU and GPU operate in while gaming. This changes a lot depending on what graphics card settings you are, how optimized the particular game you're playing in, but there's loads of fantastic resources online for finding out your particular parts operate at. For example, so I'm just going to Google 5090 Astral operating temperatures, and we can see it here. So I know my GPU operates high 50s, low 60s, approximately 57 to 64 under heavy sustained or overclocked workloads, and the temperature generally remains below 70. With these two pieces of information, I can now set my fan curves. Now we're going to go ahead and add a graph based on the temperatures that we just Googled. So to do that, click on the plus on the bottom right, select graph. The temperature source we're going to base this graph off is the 5090 that we just Googled. And here we have our first graph. The bottom of the graph, or the x-axis, is the temperature at which that particular sensor is running off, in this case our 5090 running at a specific temperature, and on the y-axis it's the percentage of what we want that fan to reach once we reach that specific temperature. So while at idle, card is not really doing anything. It's sitting at a slightly warm 42, so let's say I want my fans to run this speed, and with this graph you can click or right click to add or delete points, and we knew it's going to operate between 50.
So let's say while I'm gaming between 50 to 70, I want my fans to run at 50% temperature. Anything above that, I want my fans to ramp up a lot more. I know my GPU operates between here and here when in game, and my comfortable volume percentage is, say, around 60%. I'd also like to set the fans to near 100% once my GPU gets to the upper end of its operating temperature. And finally, once we have our graph, we just need to assign that graph to a particular fan. So say my front and rear fans, like we spoke about, I'm going to toggle them on. Just name this graph to GPU, and here we can allocate that fan against that particular graph.
So my curves typically tend to look like this. You know, it's quite linear. As soon as I start any game, I know where the max temperature is going to be. All my fans ramp up to stay at that speed. There's no ramping up, ramping down, ramping up, ramping down. This is the max that I'm comfortable with at those fan speeds, and you know, it just works for me. Let's say you wanted all your case fans to ramp up or down based on the warmest component in the system. This can be especially useful in a small form factor build where you only have like 2 case fans, or in a fully air-cooled system where both the CPU and GPU are adding warm air to your system. Enter the magic of the custom sensor. I have yet to see another piece of software do this so perfectly. It's genuinely what makes FanControl so special. To accomplish this, let's add a mix custom sensor, set it to max, and finally add both our CPU and GPU as sensors. Last but not least, don't forget to assign our newly created sensor to our graph. Now the reading we get from this sensor will be whichever component is the hottest in our system. If the CPU is the hottest, all the associated fans will ramp up according to a single graph, or if the GPU is the hottest, the very same fans will base their speed on the GPU. That's done. You know, huge shout out to Sasha Karanovic for such a fantastic device. I love the fact that I only had to install, you know, one piece of software. There's not like a separate piece of software that I need. This is the one of choice for so many people out there because it's free, it's so powerful. And you know, shout out to FanControl for being such an awesome application. And hopefully by the end of this tutorial, that's given you all the tools that you need, you know, and you have a more performant, cooler, quieter running system, you know, all at the cost of nothing. So that's fantastic. Stay tuned, guys. Next video, I'm going to be putting this open test bench into a build. So yeah, stay tuned for that. See you guys in the next one. Peace.